In late October, the British government was embroiled in yet another scandal when The Guardian published allegations that lobbyist Ian Greer had directly paid two Conservative MPs, Tim Smith and Neil Hamilton, to ask questions in Parliament on behalf of Harrods owner Mohammed Al Fayed. Smith immediately admitted it, though he said he'd had his payments, which totalled £18,000 to £20,000, most of it in brown envelopes stuffed full of cash, from Al Fayed himself and not from Greer, and he announced that he would not contest his seat at the upcoming general election in 1997. Hamilton, on the other hand, denied any wrongdoing, and in company with Ian Greer, instigated libel proceedings against The Guardian, while Prime Minister John Major set up the Committee on Standards in Public Life under senior Judge Lord Nolan to investigate the specifics of what had become known as the Cash for Questions affair, but also to take a broader view and set some rules for conduct in public office. The 7 so-called Nolan principles that emerged from this: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty and leadership, have over the following years been written into the rules of bodies from the NHS to the National Trust to universities, though of course the extent to which they are actually observed is debatable. It was not a good period for incumbent governments, it seemed. On the 29th of October, former soldier Francisco Martin Duran walked up to the fence at the White House and opened fire with a semi-automatic rifle, firing 29 rounds at a group of tourists in suits on the South Lawn, one of whom apparently had a similar haircut to Bill Clinton. He was wrestled to the ground by passers-by and held until the Secret Service arrived. Since Duran had already been convicted of a felony during his army service, he was not supposed to have had access to firearms at all, and the jury didn't take long to sentence him to 40 years in prison, where he still is. This came weeks after another former soldier had stolen a Cessna light aircraft while drunk and tried to crash it into the White House, succeeding only in hitting the South Lawn and killing himself. While nobody other than the pilot was hurt in either incident, they obviously raised serious questions about the security arrangements at the White House, and the midterms were coming up too. And so to Japan, where there was something of a scrum over who was going to be running the Mugen Honda V10 engine in 1995, especially with the new version having shown some potential. Team Lotus had in fact found a buyer in the meantime, David Hunt, younger brother of 1976 world champion James. David had been a driver himself, racing Formula Ford, British F3 and one season in F3000 in 1998, but never with much success, and despite testing a Benetton in 1988, he quit racing to start a business, variously described as selling water filters and as a multi-level marketing scheme. In either case, he sold everything to buy Lotus, which gave them enough funds to finish 1994 and hoped something came along to carry into 1995. Chris Murphy had already begun work on the 112 chassis, which had a wind tunnel model built showing the new car produced much more downforce than the 109, and the new management were hoping to keep hold of the Mugen V10, but had also asked Murphy to plan some amendments if they needed to fall back on the customer Ford V8. But Hirotoshi Honda, head of Mugen, was a popular man at Suzuka, with Tom Walkinshaw on behalf of Ligier, Peter Sauber and Giancarlo Minardi all having meetings with him over the weekend. All three were in desperate need of a new engine, with both Ligier and Sauber having lost their major works deals, and Minardi having designed a series of neat chassis that would probably have gone much better if they hadn't been so underpowered. Peter Sauber, hedging his bets, had also set up a meeting with Ford's Paul Gillitzer in the hope of getting hold of Benetton's Z-Tech V8 cast-offs. And there was another round of driver musical chairs, as, having assured everyone he was there for the rest of the season, Flavio Briatore had moved Johnny Herbert into the number 6 Benetton to replace the quick but erratic Jos Verstappen, and everyone's jaws stayed firmly where they were. Nothing official had been announced yet, but it was widely assumed that this meant he would also be Schumacher's teammate for 1995, or at the very least that this was a 2-race audition. At Jerez, the Ligier team, unnoticed in the fuss around the Herbert-Bernard switch, had also announced F3000 hotshot Frank Lagos as their new test driver, and at Suzuka his sponsorship from Elf and Gitane, and a team boss who'd been pretty clear in Spain that Eric Bernard was not the future of Ligier, meant that Frank moved straight up into the race team. Over at Lotus, another new face, Finn Mikasalo, who'd been racing in Japan for several years and knew the track really well. Simtek, also desperate for cash, accepted a big fat pile of yen from a relatively unknown Japanese F3000 driver Taki Inoue to boot Mimo Schiattarella out of the purple car for the weekend. While Karl Wendlinger had a test with Sauber as promised, but decided afterwards that his sore neck was proof that he needed a bit more time to get up to speed, so it looked like Andrea de Cesaris would get to stay in the car a little longer. except that after Jerez he'd assumed his season was over and gone on holiday, and was currently somewhere on a Pacific island beach incommunicado. So Peter Sauber asked Benetton, since they clearly weren't planning on doing anything with JJ Leto, could they have him back for a couple of races? Yes, they could, so JJ got a second chance at the team he'd driven for the previous year. All of which left Eric Bernard as the man standing up when the music stopped and he would not be featuring in Japan. Car number 11, Mika Salo. Mika Juhani Salo was born in November 1996 to a father who worked near the Kimola Raceway and encouraged his son to enter kart races at the insanely young age of 5. And there wasn't a category that went that young, because are you mad? Well, Salo Senior was, and he entered young Mika into the older categories, and at 6 he was already winning races. Despite that, he seemed to get stuck in karting for a while, and it wasn't until 1987, at the ripe old age of 20, that he finally moved up into Formula Ford 1600, alongside his childhood friend, born a couple of months earlier, who'd grown up on the same street and also got into racing, and was also making his FF 1600 debut after starting karts at a tender age. They even had the same name, Mika. Häkkinen. Salo and Häkkinen swept all before them, with Mika H also adding the Swedish and all Nordic titles to his trophy cabinet before swanning off to England to Formula Vauxhall Lotus, while Mika S took it out on his unfortunate competitors, winning the Finnish, all-Nordic and European FF 1600 titles, skipping Formula Vauxhall Lotus and jumping straight into British F3, with Alan Docking racing and reuniting with Häkkinen, who was at Dragon. That first season, won by David Brabham, saw Salo finish 14th to Häkkinen's 10th, but for 1989, with Häkkinen moving to West Surrey Racing, the pair were completely dominant, one or the other taking every pole bar 2, every fastest lap bar 2, and every race win bar 2 in a 17-race season. Salo made the early running, but a spin out of the lead at Snetterton handed his countrymen the momentum, and Mr H went on a 5-win tear, securing the title, a spot with Ron Dennis's Young Drivers Development Programme, and a full-time race contract with the newly rescued Lotus team. Mika Salo was arrested for drunk driving in London. That cost him his super licence for 1991, his sponsorship deal, and any chance of a drive in F3, let alone F3000 or F1, in 1991. But second place at the Macau Grand Prix, a result that must have been sweeter coming as it did as a result of Häkkinen being taken out by winner Michael Schumacher, proved to be his salvation, and he was offered a spot in Japanese F3000 with the AD Racing team for 5 races in 1992 and a full programme in 1993. Though he switched to the Goes Again team for the last few races, and also entered Japanese touring cars for Goes Again in 1993. None of which had been very successful, it must be said. Joint 14th in 1992, joint 17th in 1993 on just 1 point, 14th in Category 3 touring cars in that year, and after a promising start with his first podium, 1994 was turning into a bit of a bust too. So it was a bit of a surprise when he got a call less than a week before the Japanese Grand Prix asking if he fancied the Lotus seat, but they couldn't afford any testing time, so he'd just have to wing it. Having never sat in a Formula 1 car before, Salo could barely believe his ears, but managed to convey that he thought he might be able to make time for it in his busy schedule. Quote, "The next 2 nights I lay in bed smiling, so happy it was happening." Of course, there was the small money of the $100,000 Lotus needed to make it work. According to Mika himself, he put up $30,000 of his own money, begged and borrowed the rest, and with a certain flair for the dramatic, arrived at the Lotus motorhome in Suzuka with a Mickey Mouse backpack stuffed with 10,000 yen notes, which he dropped on a table and said, "I'm driving." Car 25, Frank Lagos. Born on the outskirts of Paris, young Frank was another young karting prodigy, winning the highly competitive French juniors at the age of 13 and progressing up through the categories through the 80s before moving up to Formula Ford and taking second place in the lucrative Volant Elcron sponsorship, which got him a proper go at FF 1600 in 1998. 5th overall with the best result of 2nd was respectable if not stellar, and the following year he'd got his eye in and finished 2nd overall with a win and 6 podiums. That got him a move into French F3 for 1991, and an impressive season including wins at Dijon and the brand new Manicourt track took him to 4th overall and inspired Prometecmo to give him a new car, a Dallara F392 for 1992, and he monstered the season, beating his teammate Emmanuel Clerico to the title by 100 points to 86. That in turn scored him a plum drive with René Arnoux' Dams team in F3000 in 1993 alongside Olivier Panis. Things started indifferently, a fourth place at the second round in Silverstone, his only points, until something seemed to happen to him in the French doubleheader that ended the season, and he won with the fastest lap at Nogaro, and then winning again from pole this time at Magny-Cours, leapfrogging up to fourth overall and rightfully joining Panis in his title celebrations. That set him up for a title tilt on his own in 1994, now reunited with Emmanuel Clerico at the Appomattox team, and indeed the opening round at Silverstone was another win, but while he remained consistent there was just one more win, and he ended up coming a close second to Jules Bouillon, but the testing berth at Ligier, which turned into a race drive quicker than anyone expected, did provide some consolation. Car number 32, Taki Inoue. Takachiho Taki Inoue from Kobe in the south of Japan was slightly unusual in not starting out in karting, but in the Fuji Freshman Touring Car Series in 1985 and 86, before heading for England and the Jim Russell Racing School. But he quickly found the language barrier a hurdle, plus most of his contemporaries knew all the circuits well and he'd never even sat in a single-seater before. That he finished the year at all was actually quite an achievement, and in 1988 he was taken on by David Sears Motorsport for a full season of Formula Ford 1600, where he completed the gruelling 25-race season without much to show for it in the way of results, but a lot more single-seater experience. But moving up to F3 was going to cost him $625,000, which he didn't have, so he rather dispiritedly moved back home, where the entry bar into F3 was a bit lower, and he was able to get a few races in 1990, and then full seasons from 1991 onwards. He improved steadily, though not spectacularly, joining the Supernova team. Nova being a chain of English language schools in Japan, who also became his personal sponsors, and when they decided to enter the European F3000 series, they linked up with David Sears, a former F3 contemporary of Nigel Mansell, to run their UK-based operation, since he'd already been helping them in a business capacity. And so it was that Taki Inoue was given another chance in Europe, hired to partner promising Italian Vincenzo Sospiri. But he found it a slog once more, and while Sospiri was off chasing the title, Inoue couldn't muster a single point, his best result 9th place at Estoril. Like his compatriot Hideki Noda, Inoue is realistic about his chances and aims simply at qualifying and hoping to benefit from home circuit knowledge. Things still seemed to be fractious at Williams, where Damon Hill was feeling the pressure not only of the title race, but of the weight of expectations and criticism heaped upon him by the media, while Patrick Head was apparently getting fed up of him moaning all the time. David Coulthard had been invited to travel out to Japan by Williams, apparently just to spur the race drivers on to do better, but it did also give him the opportunity to talk to Ron Dennis, who put a formal race drive contract for 1995 on the table. All David had to do was sign, but Williams still had an option on him, so he couldn't just yet. In the meantime, the question of who would partner Häkkinen, if not Coulthard, was open. Ron was happy enough with Brundle, who may not have had Mika's raw speed, but was a combative driver who'd drag the car home if he could. But it was rumoured that Mercedes wanted either an established star or a young up-and-coming racer. It wasn't just Williams where a bad mood pervaded either. Jean Alesi was smarting over his recent disappointments and was very forthright about his dissatisfaction with the car, which suited Berger's driving style much better than his own, and indeed the press had speculated that he would in fact leave the Scuderia at the end of the season. John Todt scotched those rumours while also continuing the changes behind the scenes, as Giorgio Ascanelli returned after 5 years away from Maranello to oversee the operations department, and Benetton aerodynamicist Willem Toot would move over the winter into John Barnard's team. Also at Larousse, where the team was staring down the barrel of bankruptcy, which never did anyone's mood any good. Eric Comas had been told that Gerard Larousse had sold his seat for Australia to well-heeled Swiss driver Jean-Denis Delatraz, and was also in a fouled mood. Deeply affected still by the death of Ayrton Senna, and thoroughly disgusted by all the politics in F1 this year, he'd decided months ago to retire, but to have it suddenly dropped on him that this is going to be his last race in F1 was still a bit of a shock. The team themselves were at the centre of rumours that they might, for 1995, merge with Drio Arnoux Motorsport, DAMS, the successful French F3000 team, who were known to want to get into F1 and were working on a car, but were finding sponsorship difficult to come by because there were 2 French teams already in F1, plus Renault and Peugeot as engine suppliers. The infamous underbody planks had been fitted here with 10 little titanium pads, strategically located to mitigate the wear and tear, and it had been confirmed to a few raised eyebrows around the paddock that they would also remain in the regulations for 1995. Meanwhile, a few teams were trying out different brake discs in preparation for Adelaide, which was notoriously tough on them. And with that, everyone went out on Friday for qualifying. Eddie Irvine hoping to do as well as he had on his debut last year, and Heinz-Harald Frentzen was also expecting to make use of his extensive knowledge of Suzuka, where he reckoned he'd driven 23,000 kilometres over his years in Japanese F3000. Schumacher took the provisional pole a hair under half a second ahead of Hill, and when the heavens opened on Saturday, which is the only qualifying footage I have available, that turned out to be that. So Schumacher and Hill lined up on row 1, with Suzuka specialist Frentzen a superb third, just a couple of hundredths ahead of Nigel Mansell, his and Sauber's best ever qualifying position. Johnny Herbert did well again, 5th in his first go in the Benetton, alongside Irvine, so 2 Germans and 4 Brits in the top 6. For all his complaints and an unstable chassis under him, Alesi was the top Ferrari in 7th, alongside Häkkinen, just ahead of Brundle, with Barrichello rounding out the top 10, ahead of Berger. Morbidelli was happy enough in 12th, but the Tyrrells were suffering a colossal lack of grip, and despite his qualifying heroics earlier in the season, Katayama was behind Blundell for a change at his home race. Leto was 15th on his last-minute return to Sauber. Zanardi had a reasonably good run to go 17th in the up-engine Lotus despite the lack of grip, while his novice teammate was satisfied to qualify 25th in only his second ever session in an F1 car after Thursday's practice. Panis and Lagorce lined up alongside each other, Frank just half a second behind his highly rated teammate, while Hideki Noda was a creditable 23rd and just half a second off a thoroughly demotivated Comas. And Taki Inoue made use of his own circuit knowledge to put his Simtek 26th, over 3 seconds behind Salo, but still a second and a half faster than the woeful Pacifics. Sunday morning was more of the same weather-wise, and Brundle was fastest ahead of Mansell and a still impressive Frentzen, but while it was forecast to let up in the afternoon, it just got worse. "If you can think of worse conditions to make your F1 debut in, let me know," quipped Frank Lagorce as he strapped in, while some of the teams had added more downforce, with Benetton adding extra winglets behind the rear wheels. Hideki Noda's LaRousse had electronic problems and would have to start from the pit lane, but the rest lined up in absolutely foul weather for what was going to be a major challenge just to complete the race distance. It was so dark, in fact, that floodlights had been switched on around the track, but to an extent all they were doing was lighting up the hanging spray. The green light glowed through the murk, and Schumacher cut across to the right to balk Hill before getting his foot down and charging for the corner, while Frentzen fancied his chances of getting ahead of Damon too, and Mansell had started badly again and dropped behind Herbert and Alesi, and with everyone just trying to stay on the black bit, that was where they finished lap 1, except for the ever unlucky Noda, whose electronics just weren't playing ball, and JJ Leto, whose engine somehow caught fire. As they started lap 2, Frentzen got well out of shape, bouncing across the runoff and rejoining, having lost 3 places, which put Herbert up to 3rd, but was already some way behind the 2 leaders. The gap was 10 seconds from Hill back to Herbert by lap 3, as the rain was getting even heavier, with some even reporting hailstones. It was so bad that on lap 4, the safety car was signalled, but it didn't get out quickly enough to prevent Herbert having a hair-raising spin on the main straight, just a passenger as his car aquaplaned off, as did Katayama, sliding off into the pit wall and hurting his foot, and Inoue losing it at the same spot and nearly clobbering the Tyrrell. All 3 Japanese drivers out by lap 5, and a very short debut for Taki, but you could hardly fault him in the conditions. David Coulthard in the BBC commentary box noted that under certain very wet conditions the plank acted like a rudder, steering the car in the direction of water flowing across the track. The safety car had come out in the middle of the pack and was now cruising and allowing everyone to pass it in order to collect Schumacher and Hill the next time around, so by the time that happened on lap 7, the order was Schumacher, Hill, Alesi, Mansell, Frentzen and Brundle in the top 6, with Häkkinen, Morbidelli, Berger and Blundell rounding out the top 10. Lap times were now in the 4-minute range, everyone's tyres were stone cold, and even though the rain was easing off, the track was still drenched. Once the 3 cars were cleared off the main straight, another 2 laps later, John Korsmit and Ronald Brunchereiter judged the rain to have lightened sufficiently to restart the race, and off went the safety car lights, and it peeled in at the end of the lap. So, with 43 laps left on the clock, everyone gingerly got going again, not pushing too hard before their tyres were back up to something approaching temperature, though Schumacher still managed to leave Hill behind, while Frank Lagorce was driven into by Martini on the main straight, putting both cars out and causing Alboreto to have a terminal spin as he tried to avoid them. Some expressive Gallic hand gestures from Lagorce, but now there was just Salo of the 3 rookies left in the race. And if he kept it that way, he might do well, because soon Berger was out, half of his cylinders gone AWOL, and the rain was getting heavier again. Off went Morbidelli, aquaplaning heavily into the railings on lap 13, the footwork a mess, but Gianni unhurt. And with zero visibility and zero grip, Brundle went off at exactly the same place, and his out-of-control McLaren bounced off the Armco and mowed down one of the marshals clearing Morbidelli's car. The unfortunate man, whose name I haven't been able to find, suffered a broken leg, and finally the race was red flagged.
Martin, can you tell us exactly what happened?
Yeah, I just caught a pedal wrong, and that's it, you're off the road. You're a complete passenger, complete lunacy racing out there today, I have to say. I've hit a marshal, I nearly killed myself against the back of a Caterpillar truck, which I discussed in the driver's briefing. They shouldn't even be out there. And it's just, it shouldn't have happened, and it did happen.
Will you be going to see the stewards?
I suspect we need a discussion, yeah.
So the survivors all pulled up on the grid and the deliberations began. Jean Alesi explained to the French TV commentator that the problem, as far as he was concerned at least, wasn't so much the lack of grip, but the visibility, with the spray just hanging in the air. Some drivers were keen to abandon the race, others just as keen to keep going. Damon Hill remained in his car, just trying to focus, while Schumacher, Hakkinen, Mansell and Fittipaldi, with his GPDA hat on, were all deep in discussions with Roland Brunschreiter. After 15 minutes or so, the rain stopped, which seemed to make everyone's mind up, and the race would restart. The positions were taken as at the end of lap 13, so 2 laps before the stoppage, and 50 laps would now be run, with a rolling start behind the safety car, and the race decided on aggregate times. Nobody really liked the aggregate time system, which made things very difficult to follow, as leading on track didn't necessarily mean leading the race, and indeed this was the last time the aggregate timing system was used in Formula 1. So with the 15 survivors assembled on the grid, Schumacher with a 6.8 second lead over Hill, with Alesi, Mansell, Frentzen and Hakkinen in the top 6, then Blundell, Irvine, Barrichello, Panis, Fittipaldi, Zanardi, Sarlo, Comas and Brabham. There was a new parade lap, at the end of which Panis, Barrichello and Zanardi all peeled in for their planned fuel and tyre stops, easily able to catch back up to the back of the pack as they circulated behind the safety car, though Barrichello's gearbox fritzed out and he took longer to get going. Sarlo came in at the end of the first of 2 safety car laps to do the same thing. As the rain started again, the lights on the safety car went out, and in it came. The green flag was waved, and on lap 16 the race began. Again. Frentzen had a look at Mansell as they all put their feet down, but it was all understandably very cautious. And even so, Schumacher's first flying lap was the fastest of the race so far, which indicated that the conditions were indeed improving. Barrichello's gearbox gave up for good at the end of that lap though, so that was that for him. Schumacher and Hill once again quickly left Alesi behind on track, but the leader was in on lap 19 for a fuel stop. 8 seconds, but everyone was still bunched up after the safety car, and he emerged 6th on the track between Hakkinen and Blundell, and 2nd on aggregate. Hill now had a clear track in front of him and could charge to increase his lead, and indeed Alesi, 2nd on the road with a big gap ahead, was also charging, spurred on by having Nigel Mansell all over the back of him. On lap 22, Alesi went 2nd on aggregate ahead of Schumacher, still harassed by the Williams, which was 5.4 seconds behind the Ferrari on times, and therefore keen to get past and start catching that up. Perhaps a bit too keen on occasion given the conditions, but you couldn't fault his commitment. Frentzen peeled in from behind them for a fuel stop, as did Blundell next time around, and all the time Schumacher was stuck in Mika Häkkinen's spray plume and running 3 seconds a lap slower than Hill. Damon came in at the end of lap 25 and re-emerged just as Alesi and Mansell shot past, still going at it hammer and tongs, but now the boot was on the other Schumacher, so to speak, as Hill was first on aggregate but now stuck behind those two, while Michael had got out from behind Hakkinen. Mansell peeled in the next time around, remaining 4th overall, as Blundell's Yamaha gave up the ghost. Not a good day for the local contingent, though both Lotus Mugens were still running. Next in was Alesi, putting Hill back in the lead on the track as well as on aggregate, though now Irvine was the fastest man on track, running 5th on timings and gaining on the road on Schumacher, who in turn had a clear track, was nibbling away at Damon's 5-second aggregate lead. As ever in these situations, it was getting really difficult to follow what was going on, but on lap 32, with 18 to go, Hill led Schumacher by 4.4 seconds, with Alesi 30 seconds behind the leader, then Mansell 7 seconds behind Alesi, Irvine another 12 seconds back, then Hakkinen 1 minute 12 seconds behind Hill, and Frentzen 5 seconds behind him. Irvine pitted while Hill lost time lapping Zanardi, who was running nearly 10 seconds off the pace, and Schumacher closed to within a second and a half and was coming up behind him on the road. Mansell, meanwhile, was still diving this way and that to find a way past Alesi, or at the very least discombobulate him a bit and make him make a mistake. On lap 36, Schumacher took the aggregate lead and was soon up behind Hill on the road, but now the Benetton pit crew were coming out. Schumacher was going to need to stop for fuel again. He didn't need a lot, a quick 7-second splash and dash, but he still ended up back in second to the tune of 14 seconds. And with 8 laps to go, the maths meant that Schumacher had to make up about a second and a lap on Hill to take the win and put one hand on the championship trophy. The good news for Michael was that he wouldn't actually need to overtake Hill, just pass him on the aggregate timings. The track was drying and the wet tyres were suffering, but it was still far too early to switch to slicks, so Schumacher also had the advantage there too. He was on fresher rubber than Damon. And he was really going for it, taking 3 seconds out of Hill on his first flying lap, and while Hill responded, his pursuer continued taking 2 seconds a lap out of him. It was going to be a close one. Hill lost time behind Zanardi again, while Mansell and Alesi were still duelling, providing on-track entertainment while everyone's eyes were glued to the timing charts, and Frentzen took the last point off Mika Häkkinen on aggregate with just 2 laps to go. Schumacher now had the gap down to a very achievable 2.5 seconds, while Hill nearly came a cropper lapping Fittipaldi, but he'd kept the gap at 2.47 seconds as they began the final lap. Schumacher had to lap Comas. Hill was visibly fighting the car. Hill crossed the start-finish line, and then the F1 world held its breath as Schumacher came home, but not quite quick enough. Mansell had finally got past Alesi, though he was still behind on times. So, Damon Hill had his 9th win, and probably the most important one of his career to date, and the first to congratulate him was Michael Schumacher. In something of a rarity for 1994, Williams' strategy had just been better than Benetton's. Irvine came home in a fine 5th place at the track he regarded as his home circuit, 1 place higher than his lively debut here a year earlier, and Ron Dennis would have to pay out on the bet he'd made with Eddie Jordan before the race about who would have the better finish. Häkkinen was just out of the points and the last to go the full distance, with Fittipaldi and Comas 8th and 9th, and Salo a fantastic 10th ahead of Panis, Brabham and his own teammate Zanardi, in the more powerful car, but who'd really struggled with the lack of downforce. Mansell waited for Alesi and Parc Fermé, and the pair had clearly enjoyed their joust throughout the race. As it happened, Nigel had never finished at Suzuka, and indeed had lost the title here in 1987 and 1991, and Schumacher had never finished here either, so both had at least a small personal victory to celebrate. For all that aggregate races were never popular, this one had actually given a nail-biting finish and set up a grandstand finale for both world titles in Adelaide, the first time since Mansell's famous tyre blowout in 1986 that the final race in Australia would decide the title. Damon Hill would later describe the Japanese Grand Prix as the best of his career. In his autobiography, he talked about an almost out-of-body experience just watching himself drive, until he nearly lost it at the hairpin about halfway through, which snapped him back to reality. He never said anything at the time for fear of seeming mad, but since then the idea of a flow state has become quite commonplace in sports psychology. Anyway, there was little time to enjoy the aftermath for the teams as they frantically packed up everything for the afternoon flight to Adelaide, but for Hill, Schumacher and the rest, with more bespoke travel arrangements, they would have time for a bit of a rest before the big showdown down under.